The Stardust Convention Center in Las Vegas had 1,200 seats, and every one of them was filled before the doors closed at 7 in the evening on a Friday in March of 1973. The overhead lights burned at full power. The air smelled of pine resin and canvas and the particular kind of tension that only lives inside a martial arts tournament when the competitors have already seen each other warm up and know what the night is going to cost them. The man who would walk to the center of that floor in 3 hours did not arrive with a team. He did not have a corner man. He came through the side entrance at 6:47, alone, carrying a plain canvas bag over one shoulder, wearing a dark jacket over a white shirt, and he sat down in the 4th seat of the first row without speaking to anyone on either side of him. Nobody at the registration table had called his name. Nobody at the door had asked for his credentials. He had simply walked in the way a man walks into a room he has already decided belongs to him, and he had sat down, and he had gone still. His name was Raymond Carver. He was 26 years old, 6 feet 2 inches tall, and 211 pounds of conditioned muscle that had been built across 9 years of daily training under 3 separate national coaches. He held the Amateur Athletic Union heavyweight title for the Western region. He had not lost a sanctioned match in 22 months. His record stood at 31 victories and 2 draws, and the 2 draws were against men who had reached the finals of international competition. In the room that night there were perhaps 40 people who understood what that record meant. And every one of them was watching him when he stepped onto the floor for his first bout at 9:15 and ended it in 41 seconds. What happened inside those 41 seconds is worth understanding before anything else is said, because the story that follows cannot be read correctly unless the viewer knows that Raymond Carver was not a man playing at greatness. He was the real thing, moving at a speed that made the referee take an involuntary step backward. His combination was not complicated. It was not showy. It was a jab that opened the distance, a side kick that closed it faster than physics seemed to allow, and a sweep that put his opponent flat on the canvas with his arms out and his eyes tracking the ceiling lights while the crowd was still processing the first movement. Carver did not celebrate. He walked to the corner, picked up a towel, and sat down with the towel across his knees and his eyes already on the brackets posted on the far wall. By 9:50 he had won his second bout. By 10:30 he had cleared the semifinals. At 11 o'clock Raymond Carver stood at the edge of the center ring and waited for the finalist to be announced, and the crowd of 1,200 people was as loud as that building had ever been. He did not know who was sitting in the front row 7 seats to his left. In the next 47 seconds, 1,200 people would watch Raymond Carver do something that could not be undone. And the man sitting 7 seats to his left would be the only person in that building who already knew how it was going to end before it began. Nobody at the Stardust Convention Center that night understood what they were about to witness. They thought they were watching a tournament. They were watching something else entirely. Raymond Carver's preparation for that evening had begun 18 months earlier in a gym in Culver City where the heavy bags were duct-taped at the seams and the mirrors on the south wall had a long diagonal crack running from the upper left corner to the lower right. He trained twice daily, 6 days a week. His morning session ran 2 hours and 40 minutes. His evening session ran 90 minutes. His coach, a former national team member named Gerald Fossey, had told a colleague 3 weeks before the tournament that Carver was the most technically complete heavy fighter he had trained in 20 years of coaching, and Fossey had trained 4 national champions. That statement existed on a piece of paper that the colleague had filed in a drawer, and it would be retrieved and read again much later in a different context with a different meaning. Carver had come to Las Vegas with a specific understanding of what the night required. He needed the title. He had been offered an exhibition contract by a promoter out of Los Angeles contingent on a tournament victory, and the contract was worth more money than he had earned in the previous 4 years of competition combined. He needed to win. He had been told who his potential opponents were. He had studied their records. He had prepared for each of them in the precise, methodical way that distinguished him from fighters who relied on instinct. He had prepared for everyone. He had not prepared for the man who would eventually stand across the ring from him. He had not prepared for that because the man's name was not on the brackets. The man had entered late. added as an alternate when a registered competitor withdrew with an injury at 6 in the morning, and the amended bracket had been posted on a sheet of paper next to the registration table at 4 in the afternoon, and Carver had not seen it, and his coach had not seen it, and nobody in Carver's circle had thought to tell him. And so he stood at the edge of the ring at 11 o'clock, without the one piece of information that would have changed everything about what he decided to do next. The finalist came through the side curtain at 11:04. He was 5 feet 7 inches tall and weighed 141 pounds. He was wearing a plain white uniform without insignia. He was 30 years old. He walked to the center of the ring with the kind of economy that belongs to men who have calculated the distance of every room they have ever entered. He stood there and waited. The crowd noise shifted. It did not drop. It changed quality, the way sound changes when the source of it moves from one kind of feeling to another. There was something in the way the finalists stood that reached the 1,200 people in that building at a frequency below what any of them could have articulated, and they went from celebrating to watching in the space of 4 seconds. Carver looked at him from the edge of the ring. He processed the height differential, the weight differential, the age. He processed the absence of insignia on the uniform. He processed the composed quality of the man's stance. And then, Raymond Carver made a decision, and the decision came from the one flaw that Gerald Fossey had noted in his files but had never successfully corrected. Carver trusted his eyes more than his judgment. His eyes told him the numbers. His eyes told him height and weight and reach. His eyes did not tell him what his judgment, had he used it, might have found in the specific way the smaller man was standing with his weight distributed precisely between his feet, prepared to move in any direction simultaneously, patient in the way that only comes from having been certain. Carver took the microphone from the tournament director. This was not customary. The tournament director did not object because Carver had just delivered the most electric 3 bouts the event had seen in 4 years, and the crowd was ready to hear him speak. He held the microphone for a moment and he looked at the man in the white uniform and he said, in a voice that carried easily to the back row, that he wanted to say something to the people in the building before the final began. He said he respected all fighters. He said he had trained hard for 9 years to stand where he was standing. He said he had beaten every man they had put in front of him, and he intended to do the same tonight. And then he looked at the man in the white uniform and he said that he did not know who this person was, but that he hoped the man understood what he was walking into, because he, Raymond Carver, was not a man who held back. And a smaller opponent did not change that. The crowd responded. The crowd gave him what he had asked for. The man in the white uniform did not move. He did not change his expression. He waited for Carver to return the microphone, and then he waited for the referee to call them to the center, and then he walked forward. If you have stayed with this story to here, you already understand that the man in the white uniform was not simply a tournament alternate. You already understand that something in this room is about to shift in a way that 1,200 people, and one man in particular, will not be able to explain correctly for years afterward. Subscribe now and leave a comment below telling us where in the world you are watching from, because this is the 47 seconds that changed what Raymond Carver believed about himself for the rest of his life. The referee brought them to within 6 feet of each other at the center of the ring. He reviewed the rules. He asked for a show of readiness. Both men nodded. He stepped back and dropped his hand. What followed is best understood not as a fight but as a lesson delivered at speed. A fight is not 2 men attempting to strike each other. A fight is a conversation about distance, and the man who controls the distance controls every word of that conversation. The smaller man knew this. Carver had been trained to know it too, but training and understanding are not the same thing when the room is loud and the money is real, and the decision he had made with the microphone was still sitting in his body like a weight he had not yet noticed. Second one. Carver moved forward. The distance between them was 6 feet, and Carver reduced it by 2 feet in a single step. It was the correct opening. It was exactly what his training called for against a shorter opponent. The smaller man did not retreat. He received the step, and the distance remained 4 feet, and neither man had yet committed a technique. The crowd was quiet enough that the resin on the floor was audible under their feet. Second 2. Carver threw the jab. It was fast. His jab was genuinely fast, among the fastest in the region, and Fossey had timed it at a competition in San Diego the previous year at 0.4 of a second from chamber to extension. The smaller man moved his head 3 inches to the left. Not backward. Sideways, the jab did not graze him. It did not come close. He had moved before the commitment, which is a different thing entirely from moving after it, and the tournament director in the first row put both hands flat on the table in front of him without being aware he had done it. Second 3. The smaller man stepped in. He had not telegraphed it. His shoulder had not rotated, his knee had not bent in advance, his eyes had not dropped. He was simply at 4 feet and then he was at 18 inches, and in the transition something had happened to Carver's right arm that Carver did not fully understand until he examined it later and found it had been redirected. Not blocked. Redirected, there is a difference, and the difference is the point. Second 4. Carver threw the side kick. This was his weapon. This was the kick that had ended 3 bouts that evening and had ended 31 bouts across 22 months. He generated it from his hip in the way Fossey had refined over 4 years of correction. It had the weight of 211 pounds behind it. The smaller man was no longer where the kick was going. He was 6 inches to the right of where the kick was going, and he had arrived there while the kick was in motion, which is to say he had read it before it began, and reading a technique before it begins is not a physical skill. It is a different kind of knowledge entirely. A woman in the third row who had attended the tournament for 11 consecutive years did not breathe during seconds 3 through 6. She would describe this later as the only time in 11 years of attendance that she had understood she was watching something that could not be repeated. Second 5. Carver reset. He was still standing. He was still 211 pounds and 31 victories. Nothing had landed on him. He had not been hurt. But something had changed in the geometry of the ring, in the way the space between the two men now felt different from how it had felt 30 seconds ago, and Carver's body registered this before his mind caught up to it. And for the first time in 22 months he made an adjustment that was not in his training. He swung. Not a technique. A swing. The kind that comes from a combination of frustration and ability and the specific pressure of 1,200 people and a promoter's contract and a microphone decision that was still sitting in his chest. Second 6. The smaller man slipped it by moving inside it, which is the one direction a swing cannot follow, and he was now behind Carver's extended arm, and his left hand was on Carver's shoulder blade, not gripping, simply present, the way a teacher places a hand to indicate a posture correction, and Carver felt the contact and understood in that instant with complete clarity that he was in the worst position a fighter can occupy, and that the man behind him had put him there without expending anything visible. Second 7. The smaller man stepped back. He did not strike. He put 3 feet of distance between them, and he stood there and he waited, and the referee had not moved, and the crowd had not made a sound, and the tournament director's hands were still flat on the table. And 7 seats down in the front row, the man who had come through the side entrance at 6:47 was sitting with his arms across his chest, watching with the expression of someone reading a familiar text. Second 8 through 11 belong together because they are the same moment viewed from the 4 directions it traveled. Carver turned. He saw the distance. He saw the man in the white uniform waiting. He saw, for the first time with the full weight of his attention, the quality of stillness that the smaller man carried, and he understood that the stillness was not calm. It was readiness of a specific kind that Carver had read about and been told about and had believed he had achieved but had not achieved. And the understanding was not painful in that second. It was simply clear. He attempted once more. He came forward with the combination that Fossey had built for him over 4 years, the one that had never failed, the jab and the kick and the sweep in the sequence that Fossey called the closing argument. The jab missed because the smaller man moved his head. The kick did not arrive because the smaller man was already moving laterally at a speed that removed the target from the geometry of the technique. The sweep caught nothing because the weight it was chasing was no longer distributed the way a man's weight is distributed when he is standing still. And then the smaller man did something that no one in the building fully processed until they discussed it hours later. He stepped into the center of Carver's combination, into the space where the closing argument was supposed to land, and he placed his right hand against Carver's sternum, open palm, without force, the way a man places a hand against a door to slow it. and Carver's forward momentum stopped. Not because the hand stopped it, because the hand made visible to Carver's entire body what his mind had been approaching for 11 seconds, which was the recognition that the combination was not going to land, had not been going to land, and that continuing it was a choice he was no longer able to make. He went still. The hand came down. Both men stood at 18 inches in the center of the ring, and the referee was watching and the crowd was watching, and nobody moved for 4 seconds, which is a very long time inside a competition ring. The smaller man reached down and picked up the edge of Carver's sleeve and held it for a moment. It was not a grip. It was a touch, the same way the hand on the sternum had been a touch. Then he released it and stepped back and turned to the referee and gave a slight nod that meant, in the language both of them shared, that the demonstration was complete. The referee raised the smaller man's hand. The crowd responded, but Carver did not hear it correctly. He heard it the way a man hears sound underwater. He was standing in the center of the ring and he was still fully upright, and he had not been struck and he had not been swept, and the score had, nonetheless, been settled in a way that 1,200 people had witnessed and would carry home with them and describe for years in ways that gradually departed from what had actually happened but never departed from what it had felt like. The smaller man walked toward him and said something. 3 words, spoken quietly. Only Carver heard them. He would not repeat them for 11 years. What he eventually said in a published interview in 1984 was that the 3 words had not been about the fight. They had not been about the technique or the distance or the combination that had not landed. They had been about the microphone. And what the 3 words had indicated was that the smaller man understood precisely why Carver had taken the microphone, and that the understanding was not contemptuous, and that Carver should go find out what was underneath the reason, because that is where the real training begins. At the edge of the ring, Carver stood with his towel. The tournament director crossed the floor and paused beside him and put a hand briefly on his shoulder, a gesture so small that several people in the nearby rows missed it and said nothing and continued walking. The man who had arrived through the side entrance at 6:47 rose from his seat in the first row. He picked up the canvas bag. He walked to the side exit. He did not stop at the ring. Gerald Fossey found Carver at 12:40 in the morning, sitting in a corridor outside the main hall with the towel across his knees, which was the same position he had occupied between his first and second bouts. Fossey sat down beside him. He did not say anything immediately. After a while, he asked Carver what he had seen. Carver told him. It took him 6 minutes to describe 47 seconds, and at the end Fossey sat with the information for a long time and then said that he had watched the whole thing from the back of the hall and that Carver had described it correctly, which was not always the case when men described what had happened to them in competition. What the two of them did not know, sitting in that corridor, was that they were already inside the beginning of a story. The 1,200 people in the Stardust Convention Center that night had each carried out of the building a slightly different version of what they had seen, and those versions were already beginning their long, branching migration through dojos and gyms and conversations in parking lots, and letters written to training partners in other cities. Some versions would lose the hand on the sternum and keep the microphone. Some would lose the microphone and keep the seconds. Some would grow a finish that had not happened and lose the 3 words and the touch on the sleeve. The event would become, over time, a story with a shape that was recognizable but details that had shifted like sand, and the core of it, the thing that made it transmissible, the reason it passed from mouth to mouth across decades, was not the technique. It was the moment of the open palm on the chest. Nobody forgot that. In every version, in every retelling, across every city where someone who had been in that building passed the story on, the open palm on the chest remained. Because that moment had not been about fighting, and everyone who saw it understood that without being told. Raymond Carver returned to his gym in Culver City 9 days later. He trained that morning and he trained that evening, and he did not tell anyone in the gym what had happened in Las Vegas except Fossey. He lost the exhibition contract because the promoter had wanted a champion, and what Carver had returned as was something more complicated than a champion, and more complicated things are harder to sell. He did not fight again in sanctioned competition for 7 months. When he returned, he won, and he continued to win, but Fossey noted in his files that the quality of the winning had changed. It was quieter. There was less of the forward pressure that had defined his early career and more of something that Fosse described. In a single line written in a notebook he kept in the left drawer of his desk as the patience of a man who is no longer trying to prove something. In 1978, Carver opened a school in the San Fernando Valley and taught for the next 31 years. He was specific about what he taught. He taught the jab and the side kick and the sweep. He taught distance control. He taught the difference between a technique and a swing. And in the third month of every new student's instruction, he taught what he called the most important session of the year, which was a session with no technique at all, only two people standing 6 feet apart, and the instruction was to do nothing, and the goal was to become comfortable with the stillness until the stillness was no longer something to be endured, but something to be inhabited. He never told his students what had prompted the session. He was specific about that. He told the story for the first time in print in 1984. He told it again in more detail in 1991 in a small journal published for martial arts instructors with a circulation of roughly 4,000. In that version he included the 3 words, paraphrased rather than quoted, because he said he did not feel he had the right to quote them directly. The paraphrase was, "Go deeper than the reason." The story of the Stardust Convention Center in March of 1973 eventually reached people who had not been in the building that night. It reached coaches and students and people who had never trained a day in their lives but who recognized in the shape of it something that had nothing to do with fighting. It reached them because the core of it held, because the open palm on the chest holds, because the 3 words hold, because the thing that happened to Raymond Carver in 47 seconds in front of 1,200 people is not about what he lost. It is about what the losing opened. The man who holds a microphone before the work is done is telling everyone in the room where his certainty lives. And certainty that lives on the surface is certainty that can be reached. What cannot be reached is the thing that does not need the room to know it is there. Next time we will tell the story of a man who arrived at a film set in Culver City in the summer of 1969 and found someone sitting on the edge of a flatbed truck who changed every assumption he had carried for 15 years. And why the 3 people who witnessed it have never agreed on a single detail except one. That story begins the way all the true ones do, with a door. And what was on the other side of it, and a man who was not expecting either.